Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to have a whole day, a long day of me talking at you. Hopefully, I'll keep it interesting. It's basically broken up into 4 sections, and we're going to start this morning first thing with just manuscript structure. I know some of you took my 1-hour version earlier, so you'll get some repeat. Hopefully that just reinforces and doesn't bore you. And just to give you a sense of who I am, I'm Bill Miller. I'm a professor in the Department of Epidemiology. I was here at UNC for 20 years-ish, and then I left, went to Ohio State, where I was the chair of the Division of Epi there, and then their senior associate dean for research in the College of Public Health. And then came back to UNC. And I should mention that while I was here at UNC, I was also in the infectious diseases division, saw patients and that sort of thing. I don't see patients anymore. I just am an epidemiologist. All right. I'm also the editor-in-chief for a journal called Sexually Transmitted Diseases. So I bring some of that perspective. Been an associate editor for a couple of journals as well. We'll talk about that in the second half this morning a little bit. So when we do our work as academic people, we have to write. And most people don't love writing. And this is a bookshelf in my office. And I've read all of these in order to be able to do this, to distill it for you. And that way you don't have to read all these things. Some of them are worthwhile, some of them not so much, honestly. But I try and pull the things that are helpful to you as physician scientists or just scientists to help yourself be able to write better. These are some of those books. I'm not going to spend time talking about them, but they'll be there in the handout if you need them. So the first thing to recognize, as I just mentioned, is as a scientist or epidemiologist, clinical investigator, health behavior researcher, any other researcher, you are a professional writer. That's a hard thing to accept sometimes because you think that, you have other parts of your job, but technically you have to write. Like even if it's just writing notes. I know Epic makes it a little easy, and extremely painful at the same time to cut and paste. But you do have to write. So what is the purpose of scientific writing? Why do we write at all? And you are allowed to respond to these questions. Oh, I forgot to mention, you are being recorded, so your voice may be recorded, your faces will not, but don't be afraid to speak up just because your voice is going to get captured. So why do we write?
Disseminate information.
Yeah, to disseminate information, and another word for disseminating information is communication, right? The whole purpose of what we do is to communicate. And that means when we write, we're writing for someone else. So we're writing with the intention that someone is going to read this. And we'll talk a little bit later about how different it is to try to communicate through writing than it is through talking. So I hope, does everyone know who Francis Crick is? As in Watson and Crick? Okay, so Francis Crick says, there's no form of prose more difficult to understand and more tedious to read than the average scientific paper. And that's pretty true, right? We don't want to be that person, though. We want to be the person that people actually want to read what we wrote. And I'm not going to read all my various comics along the way. This is Calvin and Hobbes, but if you sort of skip down here to the end, the dynamics of inner being and monological imperatives in Dick and Jane, a study in psychic transrelational gender modes, academia, here I come. So they're poking fun at the way academics write. Academics often try to write with big words to sound smart. They often write in a way that is impenetrable to the average person. Not as bad as lawyers, mind you, but almost. And there's no purpose for that. So we're going to try and, this afternoon, we'll talk a lot about writing more clearly. So one other little note. Does anyone other than me know what Dick and Jane is? So what was it? Yeah, it's a little children's book that in my generation, every single child learned to read with Dick and Jane. It was like, this is Dick. See Dick run. It was a little sexist because it always started with Dick and not Jane. But nonetheless, it wasn't terrible. So how do you know when a paper is well written? I mean, you read papers and sometimes you say that was terrible, and other times you say that was good. So what in your own mind will help you decide that it was well written? Not having to reread, right? That's probably the critical thing. If you can read something once and digest it, it is well written. Now, there may be times you want to go back and look at something from an intellectual perspective and think about it. That's very different than when you read the paragraph and you have to reread the paragraph and then you have to reread the paragraph again. That just means it's poorly written. So when you can read something once and understand it, that is a well-written paper. So our goal is to prove both Calvin here and Crick wrong and be on the side that people can read it and understand it. So Ed Yong is a journalist, and he writes a lot about science. He does a lot of reading about science. And this quote is a little bit more about sort of people that write for the lay public. But the best science writers learn that science is not a procession of facts and breakthroughs, but an erratic stumble toward gradually diminished uncertainty. I think we would all agree with that, right? Like, our science does not advance linearly. We sort of make little steps. And our job is to try and not oversell things, but also be ready to make the step when the step is time to come. Peer-reviewed publications are not gospel, and even prestigious journals are polluted by nonsense, and that the scientific endeavor is plagued by all too human failings such as hubris. So our mission is not to be the dumpster pile of papers. We want to write papers that are both well-written and papers that are meaningful and papers that we aren't trying to sell just to sell. So we'll talk more later about, there are times when you take your name off a paper. And that's the right thing to do. So we want to be as forthright as we can be and limit the nonsense. So we want to keep that dumpster empty, not overflowing, and we want to be humble in the way that we approach our writing. So there are three common types of scientific writing. We could add a few others. Manuscripts, proposals, and protocols are sort of the three main ones. We're going to talk today almost exclusively about manuscripts. I do talks about writing proposals and that sort of thing. I do not do talks about writing protocols. Protocols are my least favorite thing to write. And if I can get anyone else in the world to write it, I will have them write it. Those three types of writing differ. We'll talk a little bit about how they differ in a few minutes. And you do have to adapt somewhat from one to another. So writing is a skill, and like any other skill, it becomes easier with practice, so you have to practice. The more that you write, the faster you can write, the more efficiently you can write, the more that you'll learn the things we talk about this afternoon that help you write more concisely and clearly. So find opportunities to write and take them, but make them useful things to write. Don't just write like something unless you want to just write. But when you have to put your time and energy in something, make it useful for your career. And finally, remember that editing is really the essence of writing. So that first draft almost never is the final draft unless it's something that you can do in a hurry. I had a couple of very short commentaries for a special issue recently, and I normally have lots and lots of drafts. I had like 1.5. Like it went pretty quickly. I knew what I wanted to say. It came out. I could pretty much be done. But that's like by far the exception. Rewriting and editing is really what writing is about. So to write better, reading is key. So read proposals, read papers, figure out what you like, figure out what you don't like, understand your own preferences. I'm going to give you a set of preferences. Most of them are based in like communication science. So hopefully they'll make sense and resonate with you. But there will be things that you like that I say you shouldn't do. Don't do them. No, you can do them if you must. Find your own style. Writing, as we mentioned, write when you have the chance. But always follow through. One of the worst things you can do is volunteer to write something and then get too busy and say, oh, sorry, I can't do that. Look for clear and compelling papers. When you find that paper that you really like, the one that we read through all the way smoothly, find a place to put those. And then you can revisit them and see what was done that made sense. And then there are lots of writing guides out there. The one that I did, we're going to make available to you. That one has been in development for almost, actually, I guess, over 20 years now, getting updated over time. And finally, just keep writing. Don't expect perfection. One of the things we'll talk about mostly this afternoon is how perfection is paralyzing. And when you try to write perfectly, you won't write at all. Or you'll write and never release it to other people. You also have to learn to edit your own writing. It's really challenging to edit your own writing. It's much easier to edit somebody else. Because when you read someone else, you're like, oh, that's not very clear. I don't know quite what you're saying. And then you sort of work to rearrange it. But when you're writing your own, you already know what you're trying to say. And so it's clear to you. So how you adapt that and fix it is a challenge. And some of the things we'll learn this afternoon will help. Don't look, look for red ink mentors. Does anyone know what I mean by red ink mentor? Someone who will do something like this. Great start. Here are a few comments, and they give you comments. You don't want the mentor who just says every time looks great. If they always say looks great, they're not telling you the truth. Or they didn't look at it. One of the two. Because it doesn't always look great. I promise. You want people that actually give you comments. So in this course, we're going to first talk about the structure of a manuscript. I should have rearranged the slide a little bit. and how to use the manuscript structure to enhance communication. Normally I go through this order. I'm going to go through a different order here. We're going to skip to the editorial and review process, how journals work, what to expect, how to respond to reviewers, how to be a good reviewer, and journal metrics. Then we'll talk about communicating clearly in the beginning of the afternoon, and then the very end of the day, we'll talk about how to make writing a priority and time management. And again, if you were in the hour-long version, I touched on each of these just a tiny bit. This goes in a lot more depth. All right, so on to manuscript structure. Tell a story. Think about when you read something that's very compelling, does it have a lot of like pieces all over the place? Usually not, right? Like that's really hard to do. Usually it has a fairly refined and pretty compelling line of evidence from beginning to end. You have to figure out what that story is. It's not up to the reader to figure out what the story is. So whether you're writing manuscript or a grant, tell a compelling story. And what are the main things that you want the reader to know and to remember? Most of us will remember only one or two key points from a paper. Just one or two. Like if you think back to papers you've read recently and I ask you what was that paper about, you're not going to list off like a whole bunch of things. You're going to tell me the key points. You'll probably remember a little bit about the design of the study and that sort of thing. But the takeaway results, you're going to remember one or two things. And they aren't going to be a number. They're going to be the qualitative sense of that paper. So your mission is to control that story and help people know exactly what you think they should know. And one of the ways we do that is by writing for the reader, which means that knowing what the reader is going to expect. So when you read a paper, how do you read a paper? Let's say you're in a little bit of a hurry, which we always are in a little bit of a hurry.
The abstract.
Well, you read the abstract. Well, first you read the title, then you read the abstract.
Conclusion.
Thank you for the people looking at the methods. I appreciate that. Not everyone does. If you don't look at the methods, you can't really interpret the results, right? Like, it's helpful to look at the methods. We look at tables and figures often, right? And then we'll skim the discussion some. It's also helpful to look at like the last paragraph of the introduction sometimes to know that like this is a paper I want to look at. It's actually looking at what I thought it was looking at. So when we think about how a paper is structured, we have expectations. We have difficulty understanding, and it often reduces our confidence in the authors if things are out of place. If methods are in the results or results are in the methods. So that sense of expectations of this is what goes in the introduction, this is what goes in the method, this is what goes in the results, that sense of expectation goes all the way down to a sentence structure. And when you write, if you know what those expectations are, you can write so the reader can absorb it more clearly and more efficiently. So we learn to expect certain things. When those expectations aren't met, then our writing is unclear. Thing is, no one ever teaches us about the expectations, like what they are exactly. especially at the like grammar level. You sort of learn grammar, but you don't really learn that that's part of how cognitively we understand something. We just learn these rules, which don't make any sense half the time, which makes it hard. All right, so we just talked about this. When you're rushed, how do you read papers? We tend to look at the abstract. We read the third page of the introduction, third paragraph, not the third page, third paragraph. We look at results and figures. I use this figure here because, so this is an example of a sexual network in a couple of counties in North Carolina. So these are people connected to other people. You don't have to know anything about sexual networks other than to know that that's a sexual network, to recognize that that is a very dense and highly connected sexual network. That's a lot of sex going on there. So that figure conveys a lot of information that if you're skimming, you're like, oh, they're talking about a really dense sexual network. Something was going on. And then the discussion. So in a little bit, we'll talk about like how to make your tables better, how to make your figures better, how to make your figure legends better, those kinds of things. We'll also talk a lot about the discussion. And finally, when you're rushed and you're skimming, when you skim through like the discussion, when you're really skimming fast, you look at the first paragraph, first sentence of the paragraph often. Remembering back to elementary school, that's a topic sentence, maybe high school. Topic sentences are important in scientific writing for that specific reason, because we all skim instead of read much of the time. Sometimes we read. All right, what do we need to know before we start? So we tend to want to think about where we're going to publish, the target audience. You might have to weigh the target audience for your science or the best journal for your career. And what I mean by that is, let's say you are, let's say you did a study about infections among pregnant women. That paper could easily go to an OBGYN population or journal, or it could go to an infectious diseases journal. If you're an OBGYN, it's probably better for you to have it in an OBGYN journal. If you're an ID specialist, it's probably better for you to have it in an ID journal. So the best journal for you may or may not be the best journal for the science sometimes, and you have to figure out which is most important. That is reduced a little bit these days in that we don't use the paper journal so much anymore. And if you publish it and it's in PubMed, people will find it, whether it's in the OB journal or the ID journal, if it's relevant to what they're doing. But you still have to think about what's best for you. All right, finding the target journal. So who is the target audience? One big question is it generalist or specialist? Like, is this a big enough paper that all the clinical world out there should be thinking about it? Or is it really just intended for your subspecialty field? Is it more public health or is it more clinical? Those are overlapping but quite different sets of journals. And as I just mentioned, in thinking about these, you have to think about both the science and your personal career needs. So once you've figured out who you're trying to reach, select the journal and then format that paper according to the journal requirements, just noting that it's really helpful before you get before you're trying to submit it, to have formatted it in that journal structure. It'll just save you one iteration of frustration. When you're thinking about the journals, different journals have different personalities and different expectations. So do your homework and figure out what that journal has been publishing. It's not uncommon to submit a paper to a journal, or for me as an editor to receive a paper that I'm like, we have never published anything on that and we are never going to. If you had done a little homework, you wouldn't have sent that here. So understand what the journal has been publishing. Now the other flip side of that is if it's sort of a little like hot topic that's kind of a niche topic, and they've published like a boatload of papers in the last 5 years, but none in the last 2, they aren't going to publish yours either because they stopped publishing about that topic. So do a little bit of work. Again, it's just to save you the headache of an extra submission. So your literature review can help with that, the additional checks in PubMed. And then your network of your mentors, advisors, colleagues, and co-authors can help with this decision making. And then finally, we'll talk about this afternoon. Check out jane.biosemantics.org. It's a really useful little website where you can paste in your abstract and it gives you recommendations for what journal to submit to. Then ask the question, does your paper fit with the journal that you're planning to work with? And you then try to match your paper to the journal's personality as best you can. You won't always succeed, and we'll talk a little bit about aiming, where to aim in terms of the first iterations or not. And finally, one of the things to consider is, will the journal think that your work is important enough to write a commentary or editorial? Why would, and this is a question I'd like you to answer, why is it important to you if a journal writes a commentary or editorial on your work? Impact, right? Like it implies that the journal thought it was important, so they got someone to comment on it, and by doing that it says, oh, look, this paper is important. It will also get you more attention, which for your career is a good thing. So that's what sometimes, not always, but sometimes it's better to go to a specialty journal where they'll actually recognize this work as important, rather than a general journal where, even though it's a higher impact factor, it's just one of many and they just publish it. So you have to weigh, is that little bit of bump in impact factor in the journal worth the career bump that you get from publishing in the other journal where they pay attention to it? So in general, you want to aim high for that first submission, maybe even a little higher than you think it's going to go. And by aiming high, I mean like aiming at a somewhat more general journal, with sort of the top tier journals being JAMA and New England Journal and that sort of thing. Because if you don't try for a good journal, you'll never get published in a good journal. And at the same time, it helps to be realistic. So aim for the best journal where you have a realistic chance, a believable chance. It doesn't really help you to aim for somewhere where there's no chance at all. So you have to have a sense of whether you have a chance or not. And finally, if you do submit to a higher impact journal and you get a review, that review is going to be helpful. Has anyone gotten a review from like JAMA or New England Journal? It's like, they're really good. People pay attention. It's much like, I know for sure when I do a review for them versus a review for like my own journal, I give it a lot more attention. All right, so with the journal in mind, write the paper. Every paper is different, but they have a similar structure. So we're going to spend the next chunk of time talking about structure and just the formula essentially once you have this formula down, it'll be a lot easier to write. The next section is something that you all know, but there's going to be nuance here that you don't. Because you've all read papers, you've all written papers, I'm going to try and help you think about it in a way that it will make the writing part easier. The other aspect that's really important is that it's not only easier to write, your readers will be more likely to understand your paper and take away the points that you want them to take away if you've met their expectations. So, meeting readers' expectations, facilitating communication, you know what to put where, and expediting the writing are all the reasons to sort of follow the basic structure of a traditional research manuscript. So I'm going to go through sort of the outline, and then we'll talk about all of these things in a little bit more depth. So the introduction in a medical journal in particular is typically 2 to 4 paragraphs. You get the big picture, the gap, and the aims. The methods, you'll talk about the design, the study population, whether or not there was an intervention. The outcome explicitly is defined. The exposure sort of factor of interest, if there is one, any other variables in the statistical analyses. The results, you'll have something about who got into your study, the population description, any bivariable relationships, meaning just 2 variables, any multivariable analyses if you did them and needed to do them, and then any sort of supplemental analyses like sensitivity analyses. And then the discussion will be overall findings in context, putting that in relation to other literature, discussing the limitations, and then finally the implications and conclusions. So that's like the big picture outline. Now let's go through it in a little more depth. Also, feel free to interrupt me at any point if you have questions. So it's really helpful to think of the introduction as a funnel. And if you write grants, if you have to write grants as part of your job, the specific aims introduction is much the same. It has the same structure, and I use the exact same figure, as a matter of fact, for specific aims in grants. So the beginning is a global introduction. So it's like the medical or public health context. Why is what you're doing important? And you're trying to establish, you're trying to draw the reader in right from the start. And one really important thing is that first sentence of the whole paper, like make sure it's actually relevant to your paper. It's really common that people start so broadly that they've missed what their paper is actually about. Well, they've captured it in a way because let's say they're doing something with HIV and people who inject drugs. But if they start with a broad statement of how many HIV cases there are globally, you may not, if you were the reader, you may not keep going because you're like, that's like much too broad for what I'm trying to do. So bring it down to what you're actually looking at and making it relevant. Then the second paragraph, which can sometimes be more like 2 or 3 paragraphs, is the gaps in knowledge. And you'll notice that I don't say the gaps in the literature. It's the gaps in the knowledge. Because our whole purpose of being here is to learn stuff. It's not to write papers. It's to learn stuff and then communicate what we learn to other people. So focus on the science and not the literature. And I'll show you in the writing how you do that later. But just keep that. I'd love for you to have that mantra, focus on the science, not the literature. These paragraph is often the longest of the introduction. As I mentioned, it can be split. And it's not too specific, like details about particular studies and that sort of thing are not usually going to need to be there, because your job is, in the introduction, is to just set up why this is important, not who did what. What we know and what we don't know in detail is going to go into the discussion. Then paragraph 3 is going to be an overview of your aims and or your hypothesis and how your study is addressing those knowledge gaps. So this is a really important paragraph, because once you know that that last paragraph should be that, that's a really good thing to read when you're skimming, right? Like, that's a telegraphing paragraph of what this whole thing is about. So with all of this, it's an introduction. So obviously it should be introducing the story. And you're already setting the stage for the rest of the paper. And you're already controlling the narrative. Like, those 1 or 2 things that you want people to remember, you're sort of priming them for those 1 or 2 things. So how might the introduction differ for a general journal versus a subspecialty journal? Like, how might you write that introduction different if you were submitting to JAMA, say, as opposed to my journal, Sexually Transmitted Diseases?
I assume the subspecialty journal readers already have some knowledge of that topic, so you can start with more specific.
Right. So in case you couldn't hear, she said in a subspecialty journal, you can assume some knowledge about the topic that you might not be able to assume in a general journal. So when you have a general journal, you'll almost always start with a broader important statement, because you're trying to capture the editors in particular, for them to know that this is actually an important topic. So the example I use here is chlamydial infection is the most common bacterial sexually transmitted infection. You talk to any person that regularly reads STDs, they could tell you that, right? But you talk to anyone that regularly reads JAMA, 20% of them can tell you that, right? So you need to make the bigger point. But once you're writing for the specialty journal, you go much more down to the point. So screening for chlamydia trachomatis, I got an extra L in there. Chlamydia trachomatis is challenging in the emergency department. So in the specialty journal, you can get right to the heart of the matter faster. That does dissuade you sometimes from like trying too big, because you have to sort of write it one way and then you have to rewrite it another once you're rejected. But it's not that much rewriting most of the time. Any questions about the introduction? Those were sneezes, not questions. All right. On to the methods. The methods is the most boring part to write, in my mind. I'm in the midst of writing a method section, stealing from the protocol paper, trying not to use word for word what it all said. I'm struggling because I'm really bored. But I'm getting there, almost done. So the study design is usually, you start with a basic statement of the study design, you know, whatever that might be, cross-sectional, cohort, case control, randomized controlled trial, whatever it is, that's a good place to start. You'll need to describe the study setting, where the study was conducted, something about the if it's not in the US, something about the country and the population. Usually you want to be clear whether this was clinic-based or this was population-based. You want to give some sense of essentially who is making it into your study. Then the study population is a description of the who that got into your study, but also how they were recruited, how they were sampled, if there was a sampling process. Many clinical studies are just sort of a convenient sample where you're taking all comers from a clinic. The eligibility, like explicitly, you can describe those as inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria. I find often that you only need inclusion criteria because the exclusion criteria are really can be written as a negative of the inclusion. So you don't necessarily have to separate them out. And then somewhere in the methods, you have to put in your IRB approval statement. That can go here. It can also go at the very end. There's no official place for that. If you have an intervention, that would often be the next thing that's described, and you would provide that in some detail. Then how you got the data, whether that means that you collected it yourself, whether there's existing secondary data, whatever it might be. Then a section on variable definitions and decision making. Begin with the outcome. The outcome is the most important variable that you've collected. So make sure that it's really easy to find, both here and in the methods we'll talk about in the results, and we'll talk about in the results in a moment. And if you had multiple ways of defining it, explain those different definitions. Now, when you're giving your variable definitions, you don't have to give coding, like you don't have to say, you know, men were coded as 0 and women as 1 and that sort of thing. Like that's not necessarily. You just want to talk about generally how the data were collected, what kinds of data you have. You will want to mention if things were originally continuous and then categorized, and how you chose those cut points kind of thing, that sort of thing, but not in excruciating detail. Then you'll talk about your statistical analyses, any power sample size calculations that were done. I say here focus on bivariable and multivariable analyses. That's just because you don't really have to talk about that common sort of throwaway line that everyone writes, like we looked at frequencies for all the variables and measured a mean or proportions. Like if you didn't do that, then you shouldn't be writing a paper, right? So don't worry too much about that. Focus on the meat of the analyses. And then include data management issues, like, for example, if data had to be collected on paper, did you do double data entry? You still sometimes have to collect data on paper. And then always address missing data, because there's no study that doesn't have missing data, ever, unless you have definitions that preclude it. So address how that was handled. Most of the time, for sort of common everyday analyses, people will just do what's called complete case analysis, which means you ignored the missing data. But sometimes you may be doing imputation, which is a good thing. And then sensitivity analyses. Anything you did to try to explain either something that you were worried about or something that might have been a problem. So the methods in general are very similar to a proposal or a protocol. That's why, like, I can right now take from my protocol and move things over. But you're going to change the tense, because in the protocol it's like you're doing it in the future. In the paper you did it in the past. be sure to include subheadings, and generally don't try to skimp on describing the population or on the statistical analyses. Like, those are really important for people to judge the quality of what you've done. In the ideal world, the methods of a scientific paper, we could recreate the study from what you said. In practice, that actually is not usually the case. That's why there's a whole protocol. And that's also why there's more sort of publishing of in like clinicaltrials.gov, where the protocol is available to look at. This is just a little editor's trick or tip. Sometimes when in your original submission, be sure that your methods are written sort of long, meaning as much detail as you can. And when you're right up at the word limit, when it comes back from the reviewers, you're almost always going to be told to like reduce the like, they're going to tell you to put stuff in, and you're not going to have room to put stuff in. So one of the places you can cut is some of these extra details you put in the methods. And then just tell the editor that you took that out. And they'll say, fine, cool. But the reviewer got to see it, and that helped them know that you actually did all that stuff. All right. So in the results section, be sure to tell the story. So that means before you sit down to write the results, identify one or two key things that you want the reader to remember. Just like the whole paper, remember, like, the goal here is to ensure that the results section align with those one or two things. You're going to use past tense. Keep in mind that you can rarely report everything that you did. This is, I give this talk to doctoral students a lot. Doctoral students always want to keep everything that they did in their paper, because it's like, look what I did. I did a whole lot. That's really good. Aren't I good? So you have to take some of that out, and you can always stick it in an appendix. So tell the story. So how do we tell the story? Well, the first thing is we use topic sentences that help us. So make sure that you have not just numbers, but some qualitative statements reflecting those numbers to make the points that you want to make. People tend to remember those statements better than the actual numbers. When you're, because when you have a number, the reader has to interpret that number and then translate that into, like, is that important or not? But if you can guide them by saying, you know, something was increased, and then the number is sort of there in parentheses, you've directed them to the direction that you want them to be thinking.
Question
Uh-huh.
about that. I was taught that the results need to be very clear, that you don't do any kind of interpretation. So I'm hearing at the same time that you want, like, these kind of topic statements so they can remember that. But I have some real hard balance between just the facts.
Yep.
And not interpreting. So what you said.
Yeah. So I'm actually agreeing with you, but in a slightly different way. So let's say you have a risk ratio of 2, right? You could just report that risk ratio of 2. That's straight, hard fact. But I can also say that the response was increased in this group compared to this group. That's a qualitative statement of the same thing without the number, right? And that's what I'm talking about by those qualitative statements. It's like, not everything is women were 2 times as likely as men, right? Like, sometimes it's just increase. Or even just putting it like I did there, where it's 2 times as likely with the number in parentheses, makes it a little easier. But if everything is like number and confidence interval the whole way, you won't remember it nearly as well as if you put it into some words. The interpretation, I completely agree, comes into the discussion. It's more just how you're saying these things than trying to interpret it in that context. So here's an example. As an alternative measure of unprotected sex, we examined this at 12 weeks. This is the topic sentence, but it's really just to set the stage. It's not an interpretation. It's just a this is what we did kind of statement, and then goes on to show what the actual results were. All right, a few specific things about the results. One of the very common mistakes is to just put so many digits after the decimal place that it doesn't actually make any sense. You just sort of take what the output is. So in general, this is how percents should be rounded. This is from the journal Epidemiology. That's a journal where I've been associate editor for a long time. So if you have like more than 10, then you round to the whole number. If you're between 1 and 10, you round to 1 digit. If you're less than 1, you round to 2 digits. And if you're less than 0.05, then you're still just giving that last digit. You don't add another digit. Similarly, with risk ratios, odds ratios, hazard ratios, whatever ratio you want, if you're over 10, that's a huge effect. Just round to the whole thing. If you're between 1 and 10, round to 1 digit. 0.1 to 1, round to 2. Under 0.1, you still give 2 digits.
What if it's 0.001?
Like for p-value, that's fine. P-values you can give specifically, although I would rather not see a p-value ever, personally, and just have confidence intervals.
So for adjusted odds ratios in multivariable?
Yes, same thing.
Well, age, for example, is usually done by each year. So
Oh, yeah. So that's a good example. If you've got a continuous variable with an odds ratio or a risk ratio, you often have to give 3 digits to be able to make, like you need a meaningful digit.
Okay.
Otherwise, you'll just have everything would be 0.01. It would be. So that's a good caveat, actually. So if you have, let's say this is like 0.001 and your confidence interval is, or actually let's make it 0.005 and your confidence interval is like 0.004 and 0.007, you can't round that, right? Like you want to be able to see that last digit and where it falls. There are times when you're working with like EHR data where you have tens of thousands of people. You can give me more digits then. You actually have the numbers to be able to do that. All right. In the results, the first paragraph is generally going to be eligibility and participation, that sort of thing. Second and third paragraphs, we're going to talk about the population characteristics, the demographics, any key exposure, or like if it's an observational study of a medication, like how many people got the medicine, how many didn't, that sort of thing. And then your outcome variables, but don't bury your outcome frequency at the end of the paragraph. Make sure that the outcome is front and center in the paragraph. You want it to stand out. You want it to be easy to be seen. And sometimes it can be its own paragraph, just the outcome. And even if it's a one-sentence paragraph, like with the outcome, that's okay. Like make it really easy to be found. The latter paragraphs of the results are going to have bivariable and multivariable analyses. And in general, just keep in mind hypothesis-driven things are going to be stronger than exploratory questions where you dump a bunch of variables in the model. We'll talk a little bit more about what I am referring to there in a couple minutes. A lot of times you'll read papers where the only thing they talk about is like the model, and they never even tell you how many people are in each group. That's not good. So be sure to report outcome frequencies, proportions. If you have cumulative incidences or incidence proportions or incidence rates, report those. Those frequencies are really important for interpretation. Part of the reason I didn't used to have one of these slides, but I was about to give essentially one of these talks for the CDC, and I had just read an MMWR about COVID vaccines, and it was about this really rare occurrence of a side effect of the COVID vaccine, one of the COVID vaccines, and nowhere in the paper did they report the absolute frequency. They only talked about the relative effect. And so it got picked up by the press as like this terrible thing, when in fact it was like 1 in 100,000 people that had had this experience. So be sure that you talk about the frequencies in addition to the relative effects. And then this kind of information can be given for each stratum for any factor that you're interested in, and in a case control study that would be exposure proportions by disease status. Also include both unadjusted and adjusted analyses. The unadjusted things help you understand the data as they are. Once you adjust, you're talking about a hypothetical world. And also, when you look at unadjusted versus adjusted, that gives you some insight as to what impact the adjustment had. And as a reader, that can be a very important and helpful piece of information. And then in descriptive studies, where your sole purpose is to describe the population, you may not need to adjust at all. And there's a tendency now that it's really easy to do like logistic regression, that you just throw stuff in a model and see what's there. That actually often doesn't tell you very much. And that's an important thing to think about. So there are fundamentally sort of 3 different kinds of clinical or epidemiological type studies. There's descriptive studies where just your job is to describe the population. It's commonly like a survey or cross-sectional study, or even sometimes a natural longitudinal cohort study, sort of what happens to people over time. Then there are prediction, where your job is to either predict right now, does this person have a condition or not, like a risk score, or it may be to predict what happens in the future, like who's going to be, what populations are more likely to develop this condition than others. That's a true prediction study. And then causal, it means that like, does this risk factor cause this other thing? And when we just throw stuff in the model, we aren't really figuring out what we're doing, and we can't interpret them effectively. So just to give you a sense of that, I'm going to walk you through a couple of examples using this diagram here that's called a directed acyclic graph. It's a really simple way to show relationships. And you read it from left to right. Each box is a factor of some sort, and each arrow implies that there's an influence of that of like A to I, or A to O. And so if you aren't explicit about what you're trying to do, you can end up with uninterpretable results. So if we're just trying to describe, all we're really trying to do is say, these are our variables, these are how many there were, and how many people had A, also had O, how many had I, also had O, etc. There's no reason to do any multivariable analysis there. All you're trying to do is say, these people had more outcome than the other. It's not causal. It's just in the population, this group had more of the outcome than the other group. If you're trying to predict, you're trying to use this information, A, I, and C, to get your best guess as to when, like, who's going to have O or who is going to get O in the future. And there, you don't really care that much about how A, I, and C relate to one another. You mostly care about getting the information from them to predict that the outcome is going to happen. And if you're doing it in a cross-sectional sense, you can even use information that's been caused by O. So an example of that is if you're looking at an infection of any kind, you could be looking at the white blood cell count. A higher white blood cell count would imply that someone has an infection. But the white blood cell count was caused by the infection, not the other way around. Right? So in a cross-sectional sense, we do this clinically all the time, right? We use the information about symptoms and signs. Those are all things beyond the outcome to tell us that this person likely has this condition. So once we've done the prediction, we have to do additional stuff. That's where like sensitivity and specificity and model performance all come in. That's to help us figure out how well it works. And then for causality, we're really interested in one relationship and one relationship only. That's I to O, I as the cause, and A and C are what we call confounders, and we're going to be adjusting for them, and adjustment is actually critical in this context. So, but in this case, we don't want to talk about the relationship between C and O and A and O, because that implies some causal relationship there that we haven't fully accounted for. Oops. All right. So just to summarize that part, just be really clear what kind of study you're trying to do. Are you describing? Are you predicting? Are you looking for causality? All right. So then towards the end of your results section, you're going to have supplemental and sensitivity analyses. You're trying to address the what about and what if questions with those. Sensitivity analyses are really important. Like, you know, what if you have lots of missing data, what if all these people had the condition? What if all of them didn't? That gives you some bounds as to how bad that missing data could be. These kinds of things can be incorporated after the main results, and then they address things like missing data, like I just mentioned. You can address selection bias, measurement error, lots of other things with these supplemental and sensitivity analyses. All right, moving on to the tables. Yeah, please.
Is sensitivity analysis kind of a vague term? Like, if I did test for interactions within a multivariable model, that would be a sensitivity analysis?
No, that's just part of the modeling process. A sensitivity analysis is more like like if you know that there's some measurement error in your variable that you collected that you put into your multivariable model, you can correct for that in various ways. Like, you can do it as simply as saying, like, let's say you measured that 50 of 100 people had some condition. You could just like randomly select from the 50 that didn't, 25 more people and say an additional 25, if an additional 25 people that we missed had this condition, and then you do the model again, you look at what the results were, and you do that over and over again is one form of a sensitivity analysis. Another one, like a lot of times it's, just think of sensitivity analyses as what if kinds of analyses. What if I had, yeah.
So they told us in the review that, or they asked us, was our population saturated with a certain group of people?
Right.
And if we excluded that group, did our risk factors still
Yes.
result in the outcome?
That's a good example.
And it did.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a good example of a sensitivity analysis.
I just want to make sure I'm using the term correctly.
Yeah, and what you're trying to do with the sensitivity analysis is understand the bounds of what you did. It's like, how wrong might I be? Because we're always wrong. Question is, how wrong? And when you do the sensitivity analysis, you're sort of setting bounds as to what the issues might be in different parameters.
I was wondering if you had any insights on how a result section might look for a qualitative paper where you're just doing quotes, like how many quotes, how long they should be, and
Yeah. I'm like 90% sure we're going to talk about that in a second. If we don't, I will talk about it.
Just to follow up on the sensitivity analysis, the complete case analysis that you talked about for missing data earlier,
Yeah.
is that an example of sensitivity analysis, or is that separate?
Oh, it depends. So the complete case analysis is what most people usually do, which is just ignore it. So then it's not a sensitivity analysis, but a sensitivity analysis might be doing an imputation where I'm not saying you should do this, but this is an example of one where you put the mean in for all the people that are missing. That would be a sensitivity analysis. Or you do a full-fledged imputation in that group, and then you have the complete case to compare to the imputation. So essentially it's doing the analysis in a second way to be able to get information, again, about how wrong your main analysis might be. Another example, so let's say you have lots of loss to follow-up. So we have a study right now where viral suppression for HIV is one of our outcomes. This was done in a community sort of clinic setting. We said if we couldn't follow them up, we assume that they weren't virally suppressed anymore because they aren't in the clinic anymore. That seems like a reasonable assumption. So we have now information from surveys with those people about whether they were still taking antiretroviral therapy or not. So we could use that survey to like randomly assign people whether or not we think they might be virally suppressed, and then we could rerun the analysis just to see how wrong our assumption might have been. Any other questions? Those are great questions. All right. In your results section, make your tables pretty, please. Because if you give me sloppy tables, I think the work is sloppy. Like if you can't put enough time and energy into making things look okay, then how do I know that the whole rest of your study wasn't done the same way? And reviewers think that way quite often. It's not just me. We'll talk about what I mean in the second one. Try to keep the data in the column consistent. So I tend to try to have n and percent as most of the information. If I need to have mean and standard deviation, I'll put it in the text, or I'll separate it out in the table a little bit. Generally speaking, in your table, try to make sure the things add up to 100% as an example, or add up to the total number of people in your study. Otherwise, have a footnote explaining why they don't. Usually it's because you have missing data, and that's okay. But reviewers that know nothing about statistics know how to add. And they will add it up and they'll say, oh, there's something wrong here. You're trying to fool me. You don't want a whole bunch of vertical or horizontal grid lines. Just make them pretty. I'll show you what I mean. And then also, don't make people do math. People don't like to do math. They really don't like to do math. So when you have two groups, like yes and no, give me both groups. Don't give me yes and then tell me to subtract and figure out how many no's there are. And you will have people that are very adamant that you should only have one row because it makes this table smaller. Just ignore them. I have never had a journal editor tell me to take out a line to make the table smaller, ever. The table does get bigger, but it's like way easier for the person to digest. So here's an example. This is a little bit small to project, but hopefully you get the idea. A few things to note. You can see that there's grid lines for the headings. There's not grid lines for all the in-between things. We have age here given in categories. So I report the mean and the standard deviation of the age in the text, but I give you categories here. It's actually, I'm an epidemiologist. I use continuous variables all the time. I can't mentally create a normal curve from the standard deviation. Like, it does not work for me. But you give me this age distribution in a few categories, I have a pretty good sense of what my distribution is. You'll note also that I separated out the couple of variables here that are continuous, so that when you're looking at it quickly, you can scan the n in percent all the way down without having to bop around that much. And then, oh, I've changed to medians and interquartile ranges. It just makes it much, much easier. Also, to make the table pretty, the n is right justified and the percent is left justified, so they're squished together in each column. So like, if we look under overall, we come down to female, we have 75 right justified, and the percent is left justified. So there's really two columns there, and they're just hidden and you can't see it. There's also a hidden column between the overall column and the intervention column that gives you a little space. And you can sort of see it here at the top, right there, where there's that much space in between that's sort of added to make it clearer. Also note that I've tried to give the right number of decimal places. And overall, that's a pretty nice table to look at. Here's a sample table 2 where we have some ratio measures and as well as some other information. So a few things to note here. There's a clear gap between the two different types of analyses. So at the top, you see status at 26 weeks, and then you have a time to event analysis. Those are two different parts of the outcome. And you want to be able to see them both next to each other, but it's done separately. There's also a footnote that explains everything. There's a clear indication of what the abbreviations are, as well as the 1 and the 2 from status and time to event with a little brief definition of what they are. So as I mentioned, it has alternative analyses. That makes it nice. They're both there, easy to see. Finally, same thing as with the other table. We have the prevalence ratio in this case, or probability ratio actually. Right justified and the confidence interval left justified, so they're right next to each other. And we have the right number of digits. All right. For those of you that were here for the hour, I'm restating this. Hopefully you've taken it to heart. Please never write this sentence ever going forward again. Table 1 shows the characteristics of the study population. That is like a total waste of words. Serves no purpose other than to say, hey dude, go look at Table 1. Instead, just do it this way. And also this first sentence is often the first sentence of a paragraph. That's a terrible topic sentence. Just doesn't do anything. So instead, say something like this. The study groups were similar after randomization. And this little parentheses of Table 1 does the whole thing that whole sentence does. Okay? It's just wasting words. It's not like bad. It just is useless. And I would rather you used your 3,000 words or 3,500 words on things that are important, not on unnecessary things. A few more key points for the results. All the numbers in the abstract have to be in the results. Just let that sink in for a second. It's an obvious statement. The frequency with which I read a paper where I read the abstract and there's something in the abstract that is not in the results is far too high. Usually it's because they wrote the abstract early on and then they edited the results and they never went back to the abstract to fix it. Make sure that you highlight your key results from the table in the text. Some of you were probably taught, there's two things people are taught. Nothing from the table should be in the text. The other thing people are taught, everything in the table must be in the text. Both of those are wrong. What you're doing is providing all the details in the table, and in the text, you're steering the people to the results that you want them to see. So when you think about those one or two key points, they have to be standing out in your text. When you're talking about a table 1, where you have a whole bunch of demographic information and stuff, if you write everything in that table, that's a lot of words for not much benefit. But there are probably things that you want them to pay attention to, right? So you pick and choose the ones that are important. Age is almost always important. So you're giving them either information that's there or slightly complementary information like the mean that you didn't have in the table. And generally speaking, figures are good. Figures help people see stuff that you can't really see from the numbers. So use figures when you can. You should generally have a consort type figure of some sort, even if it's not a trial. What I mean by consort is that flow diagram that most of you have seen, where we have an enrollment, allocation, follow-up, and analysis. This is a model. Sort of, you can see the enrollment at the top, working your way down. This is for a trial. Obviously, you may not have a trial. Maybe you have, maybe it's an observational study. But there are forms of this table that make sense, or this figure. Part of the reason for doing this is it helps the reader know who was in the study and who stayed in the study, how many people you lost, that sort of thing. This is a really busy one from one of our relatively recent papers. It's really busy in part because we had two groups of participants. We had an index case, and then they had to recruit a injection partner for substance use. So we have two flow diagrams for each of them. Make sure that you provide clear legends. So what I mean by that is, over the last 20 years, largely, the figure legend has gotten shorter and shorter. And this is not the kind of figure legend you actually want here at the bottom. You want a figure legend where I can read this without looking at the text and understand what's going on in the figure. So give me that information so that when I'm going quickly through the paper, I can see it. I have a hypothesis why this has happened. It's because this will show you my age. In the old days, you made a figure, like by hand, with these little sticky things. And then you took a photograph of it. And then the figure legends were written on an entirely separate piece of paper. Now everything's done in PowerPoint. PowerPoint gives you a title, and people are just used to like putting the title and stopping. So, but for a paper, you don't want just the title. You want the title and what's going on. And the title is not the legend. And when you pay attention to papers that have done this, it makes it so much easier to figure out what's going on in the figure. Because otherwise you're flipping back to the text trying to figure out what's going on. Oops, I forgot my little animation to emphasize that this is the right thing to do. All right. This was expanded relatively recently, and I had a moment of panic when you asked that question of, like, did I include the old version or did I have the right version? Well, apparently I have the right version. All right, so a few unique aspects for qualitative papers. Qualitative studies almost always have a smaller sample size. Because when you try to analyze qualitative data, you're not going to go through like 1,000 transcripts. You're going to go through 30, maybe. The study population is often purposively sampled, meaning like you've picked people. They're not a random sample of the population. And the data come from in-depth interviews or focus groups, and then there's that process, and then you transcribe the data, you code it, themes are identified, and the results actually represent a synthesis of those identified themes. And quotes are used to exemplify those themes. And you can imagine if quotes are a big part of your results, the number of words that you need starts going up really fast, right? So the first thing when you're thinking about a journal for a qualitative paper is, A, do they even publish them ever? B, do they give you a bonus of words for it? Or C, if they don't, will they allow you ways to incorporate the quotes in other contexts, with another strategy, which I'll mention in a second. So here for a qualitative paper, you're going to describe the study population. Think about a table that shows the demographics of the respondents, mostly like where they came from, who they are. You often have a few different groups that are incorporated. That's really just to help the reader know who was in the study. And then in the results section is a little trickier to write than a regular quantitative manuscript, because you dance this fine line of interpretation and results. So, but your job is to synthesize those results to some extent. So identify the themes, think about the main themes you're going to focus on. Again, if you try to put too many themes into a paper, you'll have that same problem as like with a cross-sectional study where you're trying to throw everything in. It won't leave an impression on the reader. So pick out the things that are most important. Sometimes you can visually represent those themes if they relate to one another in a really nice way. That can make for a really nice figure. And then you're going to use exemplary quotes to highlight the themes with an indication of who the quote was from. Something like how old they were, their gender, their occupation, something like that. But without, I generally don't think people need to use initials or anything like that, because that's too close to identifiable. So you don't have to have a quote for every theme or every result. You can just synthesize. You want to, and you definitely don't need more than one quote. So you're picking and choosing a little bit to highlight things. So here's an example. The theme was the person who uses drugs as a victim of circumstance. So forever I said the reason I used drugs was because my dad used to beat me up all the time until I was 13 years old, and like that was how I would escape it. So that short quote is really quite powerful in terms of highlighting how that person became involved in substance use. You don't need anything else to highlight that theme, really. One of the things that's often tempting is people will start telling me about comparisons in a qualitative study of X% of people said this and X, Y% said that. That's not the purpose of a qualitative study, so don't do that. And you can't even interpret it that well because it's often a quite, the population is often carefully chosen. So don't put those numerical results in a table and try to present it almost always, unless you're doing mixed methods. And then often you'll have a word limit, like 3,500 words. I mentioned that you need more words. So one of the ways that you can do that is focus the text on the synthesis as much as you can, and sometimes move the quotes to the tables. And the tables don't count as part of your word count. Now, if you do this in a grant, I'm going to give you a hard time. Do it in the paper. That's a whole nother talk about other things that annoy me in grant writing.
Can I ask about, I'm embarking on my first qualitative paper, and actually I was going to make that same, and where mostly I write quantitative papers, I was going to make that same, like, the table mistake, even though the population is,
Purposively.
Thank you, sample, my assumption was that readers would want to still know about them. So in other words,
So
would it not be appropriate to even just have a single description and sentence or two in the result?
So you can still have like a table 1, like your traditional table 1 of who they are and how old they are and that sort of thing. That tells the reader who they are.
Right.
That's good.
Okay.
What you don't want is like,
Analysis.
how many people said this versus this,
Okay.
because that's not the point.
Yeah. Sorry. Thank you.
But this technique works you can still have some quotes in the text, but if you need more quotes, then putting them in the table can be really helpful. All right, moving on to the discussion as I take a peek at the time here. The primary purpose of the discussion is to convey the importance of your work, relate your findings to previous work, identify limitations. We'll talk a bunch about limitations, and then to put your work into larger context. And again, 1 or 2 key points, not the details. Emphasize those 1 or 2 points. So that first paragraph, put your results qualitatively into context. No numbers. Where do numbers go? In the results. So don't just start telling me all the numbers over again in your discussion. Drive home the take-home message, again, qualitatively. What is it that you want people to remember? You're controlling the message. That message goes right there in the first paragraph and in the last paragraph. In the second and third paragraphs, we're going to link the results to existing knowledge. And then if you have major differences with previous studies, you're going to try to explain why. So part of the reason why is going to be related to the strengths of your study and the limitations of your study. So those are going to ideally get incorporated there. If results are quite similar to what's been done before, then you have to justify what you're adding. You're almost always adding something, so it shouldn't be hard, but keep that in mind. And then avoid speculating. One of the common things people want to do is like make their paper the biggest paper, most important one ever. It's not. So don't go well beyond what your results show. And then obviously you have to know what other people have published. In quantitative discussions, the results have, or I'm sorry, in quantitative results, there's been minimal interpretation in that results section. In the qualitative, interpretation is part of the results process because you're interpreting what these people said, and there's no way around that. So you're figuring out a theme. So that interpretation becomes part of the results in a qualitative paper, but in the discussion you take a step back and you're saying, this is how my interpretation of what they said relates to what other people have interpreted other people saying and what we knew about the context. For those of you that were here for the hour, you're going to get it word for word. I'm going to do it again. Sorry about that, but maybe it'll stick. Avoid the litany of limitations. So what do I mean by that? This study is subject to several limitations. First, we did this. Second, we didn't do that. Third, we could have done this, but we didn't. Fourth, we also did this. But despite these limitations, the study is great. Please don't do that. Instead, weave the limitations into the main discussion. Those strengths and weaknesses are how your study relates to another one, right? So you can't wait till the end to talk about them in a well-written paper. Now, every once in a while, there's something that doesn't work itself into the upfront. That's pretty common. But if, in that case, then you need to state the limitation, address the effect it might have, and address why or why not we should worry about it. So that's 3 sentences. That's a paragraph in and of itself. So one limitation deserves a paragraph, not a sentence. When you have things you're worried about that are a limitation, do a sensitivity analysis if you can. Like if you're worried that you had a whole bunch of missing data, do something to check it. If you're worried about, selection bias, do something to test it. And then be upfront and honest about those limitations. If someone else thinks it's a limitation, address it. But don't address trivial things. So an example, how do you measure pain? What do you have to do to measure pain? You can use a scale, but what has to happen with the scale?
Ask the question.
Someone has to tell you, like on a scale of 1 to 10, how much pain are you in? That's self-report. I have read papers where they said, our pain measure was self-report. That's a limitation. There is no other way to measure pain. That's not a limitation. That's a fact of life. So, don't address trivial things. If that's the way it had to be done, it had to be done. Now, you take something like an STD and it's self-report versus a measured, that's a limitation because it was self-reported. And it has lots of things you could talk about there. If you have something that you know people are going to be worried about, even though you know you handled it pretty well, put that way up front in the discussion. Like in the clinical world, people hate case control studies. Case control studies can be elegant. They're super important in epidemiology in certain realms. If I was writing it for a clinical journal, I might make that the second paragraph, talking about how strong my case control study design was and why. In general, the more clearly you acknowledge it, the better chance you'll have that the reviewer will accept your forthrightness. So finally, if you think a limitation is so big that you don't really believe your results, don't publish the paper. Or if you're a co-author, get the heck out of there. It's not worth it. Like, your reputations are built on what you put out there. Make sure that it is quality. I promise that you will get pushback for not having a limitations section or a limitations paragraph. I promise. Resist. Keep your elbows out. Keep them away. And then reflect on ones that work. when you get that pushback from someone else, you can either just say, I was told not to in a scientific writing workshop. You can say, you can email me and I will send you from that book, from that list of books, I'll send you citations that say this. I didn't make this up. This wasn't just me. So we can overcome it. And there are a few journals that explicitly require it. There you can't help it. Like MMWR explicitly requires a paragraph. I've done 2 writing workshops at CDC. Everyone says, thank you for saying that, but we have to do it because the MMR says to do it this way. They don't have to do it for all their other publications, though. So in the conclusion, finish the story. Remind people of the things you want them to remember, those 2 to 3 things. And then consider real policy implications, but don't overstate. One of the frustrations is when someone does a small cross-sectional study and then they tell you that all of clinical practice should be changed from this. That's not true. And then avoid simple things like more research is needed. Instead, tell people what is needed. You have just done this study. You know what the limitations are. You know what the challenges are. You know what your results are. What should be the next step? How might the discussion and conclusions differ for a general versus a subspecialty journal? Think back to what we were talking about in the introduction. Yeah, it's going to be a little, you have to do a better job in the beginning, especially that first paragraph, of convincing people that what you just did was actually important in the big world, not just your little world. So a general journal, you have to justify that big importance to the broader community, and the specialty journal, it's really just how your work advances your field. The abstract's read more than anything else in the paper, so it has to accurately reflect the results. Use a structured abstract, which just means, introduction, methods, results, discussion, or conclusion. And then, just like in the main paper, write the justified conclusion. We'll talk a little bit more about abstracts later today. Try to use a simple, relatively concise, specific title that's easy to understand, that focuses on the study, not the results. Sometimes you see titles that tell you what the results are. That's not the study. The whole study is the whole study. That's sort of obvious. All right, make it a headline and an accurate promise. Try to make it interesting if you can. It should generally be non-declarative. I often use a colon with a question mark that's sort of a brief statement of the research question. And no abbreviations unless they're standard. Like I can use HIV because I do HIV and everyone knows what HIV is in every single journal I might publish in. But other abbreviations are not as standardized. Be sure to understand your reporting guidelines. So CONSORT is for clinical trials, STROBE is for observational studies, PRISMA is for systematic reviews and meta-analyses. CONSORT has all kinds of extensions. I'm not going to go through all of these, but if you're doing something that's more like a pilot study, go to CONSORT and find out what is expected to be there. Every guideline, like the CONSORT ones, has both a statement and a manuscript and checklists. So the checklists are most helpful for working through your what you actually include, but the statement can be quite helpful in terms of understanding what should go in. And sometimes if you want a little more depth about how they got to where they're at, the manuscript can be helpful. Use those guidelines to help you organize the manuscript, just like this talk. And then if you know you did a clinical trial, go to the CONSORT guidelines beforehand so you make sure actually even before you start the trial, to make sure that you collect the data that you're supposed to collect. That outline will help you write the paper and make sure you don't forget anything important. So just to give you a sense, this is the Strobe checklist for cohort studies. You'll see on the left-hand side there basically the same things that we were talking about. Go into the introduction, the methods, more on the methods, same things we were talking about, and then the results look very much like what we just described. And in the discussion, you'll note that they say discuss the limitations, don't list the limitations. There's a difference. Sometimes you might be writing something that's more of a methods paper, where you're developing a new approach. The sections of those papers are the same. You still have methods, results, and discussion. Sometimes you have a new application of a method in a different space. Those can be challenging because you're trying to do two things at once. One is describe that method to a new group of people, but you're also trying to answer a question. So you have to kind of decide which side you're on. Is it more about applying the new method, or is it more about answering the question? So trying to combine both is a nearly impossible task. So figure out whether you're describing the method or answering the question. Editorials and commentaries are other important things. We'll talk about a little bit more about these in a little bit. So editorials are commonly requested by an editor. You might have been the reviewer. Commentaries are author-initiated, and you usually ask permission to write one. They focus on some hot topic or are written in response to a particular paper, and they're a great way to focus your thoughts. They can be really influential. To do this, it's more like writing an essay like you wrote in college. So identify the key points that you're trying to make. Begin with a short introduction, describe what the problem is, provide your thoughts, and then aim for balance and accuracy and conclude with what needs to be done next. Systematic reviews are another kind of special paper type. They also follow the standard paper format with an introduction, methods, results, and discussion. They'll follow the PRISMA guidelines. But here the methods are really about the search strategy and how papers were allowed to enter into your process, and then your process for review. So in general, remember to write for the people that are doing the review. So, and if you know who those reviewers are, target your paper a little bit to them. So for example, if you're writing in a field where there's really two camps of people, which is not uncommon, like one group thinks this and one group thinks this, you can pretty much guarantee that one of the reviewers is going to be from the other camp. So you can't say that the other camp is like ignorant, right? So you have to be a little more savvy and a little more upfront about that.
Can you address reviewers? So I've had some submissions where they assign the reviewers and others where they've asked you to select a reviewer.
Yeah.
How do you do that?
We're going to talk about that in the next section, as a matter of fact. So know who the key people are in your research area, and the references you cite are a likely source of reviewers. So if you know their biases, you can address those in the paper, especially in the discussion. So you will be rejected. Hopefully not like Snoopy, where he gets 2 for 1 here. And be prepared. Just have a thick skin. And the reasons why things are rejected are often related to the introduction being too long, too much detail, not enough information about the methods, or they were just not good enough. things don't flow. You've put too much stuff in. Remember, 1 or 2 key results. The figures didn't help. The discussion was rambling. I hate rambling discussions. You didn't discuss some major limitation. You weren't clear enough. It didn't flow. You had too many stories. You didn't tell the main story. And the worst one of all is you read the whole paper and you have no idea what they were talking about. So in conclusion, tell one story and communicate. Use a manuscript structure to meet the reader's expectations. Funnel the introduction in 3 to 4 paragraphs. Make your tables and figures easy to read and effective. Focus your discussions and write for the reader.